Allen's Investigate, airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans. Yay, and welcome to the Allen's Investigate with me, Shona Allen.
And I'm Gary Allen, the Cockney Bard.
We're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network 105.3 and 107.7 FM from New Orleans and also on Roku. Now, this week, we'd like to welcome back special guest Ralph Ellis, fascinating writer, historian and independent researcher of biblical and Egyptian history for more than 40 years. Welcome, Ralph.
Hiya, Ralph.
Good to be back with you again. Getting quite regular, this one, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, you'd have to bring your sleeping bag, I think.
Yeah. Well, you've always got something good to say, Ralph. That's why
exactly. That's because you're so interesting. That's why.
Yeah.
So,
and I must apologise to viewers, anyone who can actually see the video. My standard camera is not working, so I've got the backup camera on anyway. So I'm a little bit dark, but anyway.
Oh, you seem fine from where
I'm
I'm looking.
Yeah, you look all right,
anyway.
Ralph. No problem.
And anyway,
good, excellent.
It doesn't matter on the radio, does it?
No, that's true.
Anyway, tonight we're going to be talking all things Arthurian legend and King Arthur. So, Ralph, I don't know whether you just want to start off by giving us just a quick précis about yourself, just in case there's any listeners that haven't seen you on our show before.
Yes, well, I started looking at the Old Testament and New Testament. That was back in 95, I think. So I've been at this quite a long time. I've written 14 books on this subject. Mostly about revisionary theology, I call it, trying to place the Old and New Testaments back into the historical record with quite some success, I have to say. I found most of the events and most of the characters. From a secular viewpoint, I don't look at the theology of it, the spirituality. I'm just looking at the history. And as a part of that, I found lots of little things in the New Testament that was sort of very similar to Arthurian legend. And so that made me very interested in that. And I ended up writing a whole book, 600-page book on Arthurian legend, which is called The Grail Cipher.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, that was all very interesting. Very unexpected, actually. I didn't think... I've never researched Arthurian legend before. It was nothing to do with what I was doing. I was looking at the Old and New Testaments, and suddenly I found myself stuck right in the middle of Arthurian legend.
Yeah, it's quite a lot of writing, 600 pages as well, isn't it? So,
yeah, it's a big subject.
Yeah,
it's a very, very big subject. People don't seem to realize they think it's all just, Geoffrey of Monmouth, and that's about it. But no, it's rather larger than that.
Yes.
The Vulgate cycle, which we will talk a little bit about, is 9 volumes and about 5,000 pages or something.
Goodness.
So it's quite big.
Yeah. So that must have taken you quite some time to read that then.
It did, yes. Not many people do. I was disappointed because I read a few standard research papers into Arthurian legend.
Yeah.
And they don't look at the Vulgate cycle because it's too impenetrable. And yet some of the very interesting stuff is in the middle of the Vulgate cycle. And therefore you get a very poor view of Arthurian legend from many modern researchers because they just don't look at it in detail. So it did take me a couple of years of non-stop, every day, 7 days a week, sort of 12 hours a day.
Gosh.
Researching, reading and researching. So, yes.
And also the thing is as well with quite a lot of researchers is they do tend to borrow quite heavily off other researchers, earlier researchers, and kind of build on that. So, to be able to go right to the source and do it yourself without relying on other people.
And the trouble is they make it fact as well, don't they? That's the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. They have relied on each other to a great extent, and therefore they've even placed the story in the wrong location. They're all talking about Wales without realizing that the original text talks about Galles, not
Right.
Wales. Now, Galles may well be the original name for Wales, which is where the confusion steps in, but the Galles were also the eunuch priests of Galilee. Did we talk about those in the New Testament talk? I can't remember. Did we talk
No,
about
you can go on a bit about them, Ralph.
Well, yeah, I think probably if you mention it again, as I say, just
Yeah.
in case people haven't listened to the others and we've got some new listeners, I think that would be well worth it.
Yeah, it'll come up in dispatches somewhere, I'm sure. We'll talk about them.
Okay, so where would you like to begin, Ralph? Shall we begin at the beginning?
At the beginning, why not? Yeah, it's always a fairly good place to go to, because there's secrets to be held even in the manuscripts, the literature that we have of Arthurian legend, because everyone has this view of Arthurian legend. They've seen the films, they've read a few books maybe, and they have this idea of Arthur as this dark age king fighting against Romans or whatever, bit like a medieval knight, on horseback with armor and the rest of it. That is not what it would be for starters. It's supposed to be dark ages. They didn't have knights in shining armor in those days. They didn't even have knights in Norman armor, which is how they are portrayed. We'll see that in a minute.
That's minor details.
Minor details. But this was supposed to be Dark Age Britain. And of course, we don't have many chronicles of Dark Age Britain, but we do have a few. And the problem is they don't mention King Arthur. And people get very upset. Yes. People get very upset with this and say, yes, they do. Yes, they do. And so I say, well, okay, give me a quote. And for the first time, of course, they actually go off to try and have a look at these manuscripts, and they suddenly find that there is no King Arthur. And that's a problem. So the first chronicler we get is Gildas. Now, he's 5th or 6th century. And he was writing the ruin and conquest of Britain. He's talking about the Saxon invasions. And there's no King Arthur. No mention of Arthur at all. Then we get the Venerable Bede. Most people have sort of in history know something about the Venerable Bede. He wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English. Yeah, he's 8th century, and he makes no mention of King Arthur at all. Now, this is the era that he's supposed to be in. He's supposed to be Dark Age. He's supposed to be 5th or 6th century. And the chroniclers from that era don't say anything about King Arthur. Then we get Nennius, History of the Britons. He's 9th century. Now, he mentions a warrior, a Dux Bellorum, I think he calls him, a Duke of War. But there is no King Arthur. There's no royal court. There's no Camelot. There's no Guinevere. There's no knights. It's simply a story about a knight called Arthur who did some valiant deeds, and that's it. So there's still no King Arthur. And then suddenly we get up to the 12th century, 1125. So we're talking about 600 years after King Arthur is supposed to have lived. And suddenly we get the entire story. All of it. From nowhere, just pop. There it goes. King Arthur story. And that's William, no, actually before this, I should say that William of Malmesbury, so he was 1125, Chronicle of the English Kings. Again, he doesn't mention King Arthur. Henry of Huntingdon, History of the English, 12th century again, 1130, doesn't mention King Arthur. And then, we get to Walter of Oxford and Geoffrey of Monmouth. Now they're 1135, so we're talking about 10 years later. 1135, and that is when we get the full Arthurian story. And it's complete. Apart from there's no round table, there's no Lancelot. Apart from that, it's the complete story. All of a sudden, 11.
Does that involve the Holy Grail as well in that story?
Yes. trying to think of. I think that comes
Galahad.
more from Eschenbach. We're talking about him in a minute, the
Okay.
German version of it.
Mhm.
But yeah, pretty much it's the complete story. And of course, the Holy Grail does come into this a great deal. We'll talk about that later. So this is very odd. We've got a 600-year gap between when this guy was supposed to have lived, no history of him whatsoever. Suddenly in 1135, we get Geoffrey of Monmouth giving us the full story. But then we go another 10 years, no, another 20 years beyond that. We get William of Newburgh. Now he makes the history of English affairs. Now this is a really good history of England. It's a vast volume, you know, so there's a lot of time and expense gone into making this book. And he doesn't know anything about King Arthur. So this is like 30 years after, no, 25 years after the story has been written. And William of Newburgh doesn't know anything about it. And he ridicules the idea of King Arthur. So he says of Geoffrey of Monmouth, he says, only a person ignorant of ancient history can for a moment doubt how impertinently and impudently Monmouth falsifies the history in every respect. Whatever Geoffrey has written is a fiction, invented either by himself or by others, and promulgated either through an unchecked propensity to falsehood or a desire to please the Britons. For how would elder historians, who were ever anxious to admit nothing remarkable, and even recorded trivial circumstances, pass by unnoticed so incomparable a man such surpassing deeds as King Arthur? How could they, I repeat, by their silence, suppress King Arthur, a British monarch who was superior to Alexander the Great? So this is 12th century, and William of Newburgh is saying there's no such thing as King Arthur. It's an invention by Geoffrey of Monmouth and Walter of Oxford.
Yeah, interesting. And I think that Geoffrey of Monmouth, it seems that he kind of involved legendary tales of folklore and chronicles and a variety of different sources into making King Arthur. And I think one of the people in particular was Ambrosius Aurelianus, wasn't it, that he kind of based it all on?
Well, this is where they've linked it back into real history. So Monmouth and Oxford link Arthurian legend back onto Constantine III and Aurelius, as you say, who was one of the sons of Constantine III. So they link it back into English, British history, of Roman history. With Constantine III, we're talking, sorry, not Constantine III. Constantine III was one of these usurper emperors of Rome who went down and conquered Rome. He was 390s AD. No, he links him back onto gosh, I'm forgetting his name. No, it is Constantine III, isn't it? And his son Constans. And they were... I'm just forgetting my history for a little bit.
No, that's all right.
390s.
There's no need to worry.
390s AD, and they became usurper emperors of Rome. So there was a British emperor of Rome, and he went down and he conquered France and he conquered Spain. And that is a history that's fairly well known. That's a part of real history. So we have this local king who had been a commander in the Roman army. This is when the Western Roman Empire was breaking up. This is when Britain was being let loose from the Western Roman Empire. So in 405, Britain had been sort of rejected from the Roman Empire because it was too difficult to maintain. By about 410 AD, Britain was no longer in the Roman Empire. And this is when we get Constantine III. And so Geoffrey of Monmouth is linking this history of King Arthur back onto that history of Britain, of Constantine III. So there is slightly, you might say, a historical link there for his version of King Arthur, but there is no evidence from real history that Constantine III ever had these extra sons or grandsons who were linked onto his royal family. And certainly William of Newbury knows nothing about it. So there is a problem with the history. There is no evidence whatsoever for King Arthur. In the archaeological record or in the literary record, apart from this sudden mention we get by Walter of Oxford and Geoffrey of Monmouth, suddenly this story appears from nowhere. And the other problem is that this is not a British story. And again, that's not well taught if you read other reference books about King Arthur. The only place you cannot find an original manuscript of King Arthur is Britain. So you get them from Germany. You get Lancelot, Tristan, Eric and Ewain. You get Daniel von Blumenthal, I think, is one of them. Parsifal, of course, by Wolfram von Eschenbach. You get them from Holland, History de Van Grael, Roman van Valwijn. You get them from Italy, Tristano, and La Vita de Merlino, and all these sort of things.
The Life of Merlin,
Yeah, you get these manuscripts from all over Europe. And the only place you don't get them from is from Britain. I was gonna the only one we get, because of course Oxford and Monmouth, people will say that's a British version, but they say in their manuscripts that they got their manuscripts from Normandy, and Brittany. So they were French versions. Of course, we get lots of French manuscripts as well. And the situation was so bad that Thomas Malory, who you might say again is another British version of King Arthur, but that's very late. Malory is very late. And he only wrote it because he couldn't find a British version. So in his preface to Mort d'Arthur, Malory says, "For in all places, Christian and heathen, Arthur is reputed. He is more spoken of beyond the sea, more books made of his noble acts than there be in England, and they are in Dutch, Italian, Spanish, Greekish, and French."
Interesting.
Now, that's from the preface of Thomas Malory, because he couldn't find a British manuscript about King Arthur. And that brings us on to the other thing, which is interesting, which is, where is the earliest sculpture of King Arthur, I wonder. So I'm going to see if I can do a share screen. So where do we think the earliest sculpture of King Arthur would be? Where would we be looking? Tintagel, Cumberlandnum, where else? Cadbury Castle, somewhere like that, because this is a very early one. It's 12th century, so it's the same sort of era as Monmouth and Oxford.
Are we going outside Britain?
I'm afraid we are.
You're going to upset the Welsh and those in Glastonbury. You do realise this? Good grief.
A long way from Glastonbury, I'm afraid.
Oh, no.
This is it.
The whole industry just died
Lord.
So, is that sharing? Can you see that?
Not at the moment.
Oh, not at the moment. Let me.
Oh, here it
comes.
comes.
Here it comes. Yes, you'll have to describe it for the listeners, obviously.
Yes. So we've got the an arch over a doorway here. It's a doorway in a cathedral.
Ooh.
And it's got all the characters of Arthurian legends. So we've got the knights on both sides, and they're all named. They've got little names on the top of them. And they're all in Norman armor on horseback, charging against a castle. And the castle is at the top, and in the top we've got Wenlegi, who is Guinevere. You can hear the name.
Yeah.
And Mordred, who's the son of Arthur.
Yeah.
King Arthur is the one on the left here. I don't know if you can see my cursor.
Yeah.
He's the only one not wearing armor.
Oh.
And it says Arturus above his head.
Yeah.
So this is the earliest sculpture we have of King Arthur, and it's on the doorway of the Modena Cathedral in northern Italy.
Ah. Is that Modena where you get the balsamic vinegar?
It's certainly where you get Ferraris from.
Oh, even better.
So if you're down in northern Italy and you've got any interest in cars, and you go to the Ferrari Museum, which is very interesting. It's a great museum. But just down the road in the center of Modena is this cathedral. And it's got this inscription and sculpture of King Arthur in it. And this is a close-up of the castle at the top of this sculpture. And you can see a sort of weeping Guinevere on the left. She doesn't look very happy, does she?
No.
They're not very happy.
On the right is
Glastonbury at the moment.
is Mordrain, and it's I don't know. It's quite a accurate sort of drawing. I think they've got siege engines by the looks of it to siege the castle, made of wood.
It's fabulous carvings, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because there is this there is a story in Arthurian legend about Guinevere and either Lancelot or Mordrain locking themselves in a castle because they had eloped, because Guinevere and Lancelot eloped. They were an item sort of thing.
This is very interesting, Ralph, to me, because I can't tell you the name of it. I've forgotten off the top of my head, but there is a castle in Italy where there is actually a sword in a stone, isn't there?
Yes, there is. There is that one as well. I don't have a picture of that, but yes, you can look that up online. There is the sword in the stone in Italy. It's a fairly old one again. I think it goes back to the medieval era. So there is this tradition, because we have more of these. Here's another one. Now, this is exactly the same scene. It's in slightly more detail, and it's above a cathedral. And this is, oh gosh, where is this one? This is Bari. So Bari is in the south of Italy, on the sort of heel of Italy. And this is again over the cathedral, and it's exactly the same scene with the Knights of the Round Table besieging the castle at the top with Guinevere and Mordrain in it. And I'm not sure if we can zoom in. Oh, a little bit we can zoom in. You can see the castle has even got a padlock on the front of it.
Fabulous, isn't it?
A very old medieval padlock on the front of it.
Do we have exact dates for these, Ralph? These
are 12th century.
12th century, okay.
So 1100s. So pretty early, as early goes.
Fabulous.
And then here's another one. This is a mosaic. And it even says, just in case you're not quite sure, it says Rex Arturus.
I
guess that's a bit of a clue, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so it's a mosaic of King Arthur on we don't know what, because if you look, he's on a sort of animal, riding an animal, but the animal has cloven hooves.
It looks like a goat, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's got horns on it. But why would Arthur be riding a goat or something of that nature? Yeah, I don't know. It's a bit strange. I did do an article on this because the people who made this mosaic do know what a horse looks like, because there's another horse next door which has proper horse's hooves on it instead of cloven hooves. So anyway, this is from the cathedral at Otranto, which is in the south of Italy again.
Okay.
So we have this very, very definite link between King Arthur and Italy at the very least. And we have, of course, very strong links with Normandy, with northern France. So, you know, at the very least, we know that King Arthur was a European monarch, not a British monarch. Which is odd. You know, the story is not as we might expect. And so where should we go from here? I'm just thinking where to attack this first, because there's lots of information.
What about the Knights Templars in relation to that? Because obviously there were Templars in Italy and France, weren't there?
Well, that's probably where the story came from. But before we get to that point, we need to know that there is a definite link here with the Near East and with the sort of biblical story. This is the direction we're going to. And of course, the Templars came from the Near East, and so they would have known all about it. Probably the best way to introduce this is from High History, which is a very strange manuscript about King Arthur. Not all Arthurian manuscripts are the same. Some of the early ones are very, very different, and they tell a very different story. High History is one of these very strange ones, and it's very early. And it portrays King Arthur in a very strange fashion. So this is a quote from a lady in this story of King Arthur. And she's talking to King Arthur. She's just come across this knight in the forest, as it were, but she doesn't know who it is. And she says to this knight, "I was thinking of going to King Arthur's court, but I've met 20 knights, and each of them told me that the court of King Arthur was the vilest in the whole world. And all the knights of the Round Table have renounced it because of its badness and evilness. Who cares for Arthur's good beginning when the end is so bad? And it is distasteful that a decent knight such as yourself should have the same name as such an evil king."
I mean, where do you think the name Arthur comes? Arthur's a very English name or British name, isn't it? So,
well, no, it's Greek.
Greek, is it really?
Yeah, it comes from the Ursa Major, the Great Bear. It's named after a bear, and of course, the Great Bear is the center of the zodiac. Because in the center of the zodiac, you can either have the sun image, which we'll look at in a minute, or if you look up at the heavens above, you end up with the pole star and the northern stars, which is Ursa Major. So the central image in a zodiac is either the sun or it's Ursa Major. And Ursa Major is the Great Bear, and that is what King Arthur was named after. Therefore, King Arthur is the central image inside a zodiac, the same as Jesus was when we were looking at zodiacs in the previous talk. So both of them are the center of a zodiac. And we'll come on to that. Don't let me forget. We'll come on to that in a minute, because that is central to the story. So we have this problem with manuscripts like High History, which gives us a different view of Arthurian legend. And the other problem with High History is the author that it says wrote it. And we get the same. Is this from High History? Yeah, this is a quote from High History. It's talking about how this manuscript was written, how it came into existence. And it says, "Josephus, the good clerk, tells us about the good knight who is Percival, how he has come, of whom you will hear the name presently. Hear you the history of the most holy vessel that is called the Grail. Josephus has written this in remembrance by annunciation of the voice of an angel. The good knight, who is Percival, was of the lineage of Joseph of Arimathea, and this Joseph was Percival's mother's uncle, who had been a soldier for Pilate for 7 years. This is awkward because it's saying that Percival, Sir Percival, who's one of the Knights of the Round Table, was a nephew of Joseph of Arimathea. So he was alive in the 1st century.
Yeah.
Not the Dark Ages. And then it says, King Hermit came from the forest and could not find his nephew, who is Percival, in the hermitage. So he mounted a white mule that he had there. She had a star on her forehead in the shape of a red cross. Josephus, the good clerk, tells us that this same mule belonged to Joseph of Arimathea when he was a soldier working for Pilate. So one of the key characters in Arthurian legend has a mule that belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. So either this mule is 500 years old, or we have a problem.
The fountain of immortality, but the sound of it.
Oh, must be to do with the Grail, obviously. Yes. Yeah, that's what they say in the films, don't they? The knights live forever as long as they have the Grail or something. Yeah, I seem to remember that in one of these Hollywood films. So we have a problem here in the chronology and the location. In many of these manuscripts, they say that Arthurian legend was written by Josephus Flavius. That's a problem. Josephus Flavius was the Jewish historian from the 1st century. Right. So William Neitz, who's one of the fathers of Arthurian research, he was a professor in America, 1903, in his dissertation, he says, the role of Josephus, he's talking about Arthurian legend, the role of Josephus is of greater importance in our work than Joseph. It is Josephus to whom we owe the tale. He is known as the good clerk and the good hermit. Twice the text simply calls him Joseph, and twice he is called Josephus. Nevertheless, it is now supposed that the confusion of these two Josephs, Joseph of Arimathea and Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian, gave rise to the legend of Joseph and his son Josephus, as mentioned in these Arthurian manuscripts. So we have this confusion between Joseph of Arimathea and Josephus Flavius, which I think we've looked at before and we'll look at again, all to do with Arthurian legend. And Brugger says the same. So Brugger is another of these old venerable Arthurian historians. This is from, he's a German chap, Ernst Brugger, 1906. And he says, because even if Josephus Flavius was very well known as a historian, and even much respected and held as a Christian historian, it remains striking that there could be that he could record events from British history that occurred many centuries after his death. I think these oddities are only the result of a confusion. So all the way through these alternate manuscripts, High History, and also from the Vulgate cycle, History of the Holy Grail within the Vulgate cycle, it is saying that the original author of Arthurian legend was Josephus Flavius in the 1st century. That is a problem for the standard history we have, or we think we have, of Arthurian legend, that he was, a British king. However, the fact that we now know that all of these manuscripts are European, pretty much, we don't have any British ones, The fact that the early manuscripts are all in Italy and not in Britain, it gives us a different view of what this story was about. And the clue, as you said just earlier, is the Knights Templar. Because this story only arrives in 1130. Sorry, not 1130, 1135, with Walter of Oxford and Geoffrey of Monmouth. And that is only like 6 years after the Knights Templar were ratified as an organization, a Christian organization. So immediately after we get the Knights Templar being established, and remember the Knights Templar are a society with secrets, you might say.
Yeah.
Very Masonic. In fact, they are the originators of Masonry. And it's an initiatory sect or religion. You have to be initiated into the Knights Templar. It is a society with secrets. And what sort of secrets did they hold? Well, the interesting thing is this all is all to do with the Crusades. And a funny thing happened on the way to the Crusades, you might say. So the first crusade is from this era. It's 1096 is the first crusade with Count Baldwin of Boulogne, who goes out with the first crusade. And they go all the way across Anatolia, and they get to Antioch, which is on the sort of northeast corner of the Mediterranean. And they don't turn right, they don't go to Jerusalem. The first crusade went east, it went across the Euphrates, and the first city that they liberated from Muslim control and oppression was Edessa. So in the last talk, we were talking about Jesus might have come from Edessa. He might have been connected with the Edessan royalty. The first city that was liberated by the first crusade was Edessa.
Interesting.
So why did they go to Edessa? Why didn't they go to Jerusalem? If you're going out there to save Christianity, from Muslim control, wouldn't you go down to Judea? But they didn't. They went to Edessa, which is where I say Jesus actually came from. So why did the first crusade go to Edessa? Well, if they had had any inkling of this story, of this history, they might well have known that any secrets, any genealogies, any history, any archaeology of New Testament events would be found in Edessa, not in Jerusalem so much, because it was known, and this is fairly new research, it was known in this era that Edessa was something to do it. I've just found further records from the Anglo-Saxon chronicles that Alfred the Great, so he's 9th century British king, he sent a bishop of Salisbury to India to give tribute to the Church of St. Thomas in India, in southwest India. It's called the Church of Malabar. But the Church of Malabar is an Edessan church, which I didn't know anything about until recently, even though I've written this enormous great book on Jesus being a king of Edessa. It wasn't until about 6 months ago that I found out that there was a church of Edessa in India.
Interesting.
Which was founded by St. Thomas, and St. Thomas was Judas Thomas Didymus, who was supposed to be the twin brother of Jesus.
So do you think perhaps that's where this there's one or two people have spoken in the past about Jesus's travels, and they said that he traveled to India and various other places. Do you think that that's where the seed of that comes from?
Indeed, yes, very much so, because from the Acts of Thomas, which is an apocryphal sort of gospel, of course, initially I read it as being a very fanciful story. It's about Jesus sending this person, Thomas, who happens to be a carpenter, who happens to look just like Jesus. They can be mistaken for each other. And obviously Thomas means the twins, so therefore we know why they can be mistaken for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And sends him to India, and where he works for a king out there, and he's supposed to be building them a castle, but never does. He spends the money on the poor instead. And so the king wonders, where's my castle you're supposed to be building? Because he was a carpenter, he was a mason, he was an architect. Where's my castle? And he said, well, I wasn't building you treasures here on earth. I was building you treasures in heaven, where moths cannot eat and rust cannot get to it. Which is a quote from the Gospels. It's the same as Jesus says in the Gospels. And this guy was supposed to have gone out to India. Well, at the time, I thought that was a fanciful story, but it transpires there is a church of St. Thomas in India, and it was set up in AD 55 by St. Thomas, who was supposed to be the brother of Jesus. And it got to about the 4th century, early 4th century, and they were running out of people there, attendees of this church. So what they did is they sent the bones of St. Thomas back to Edessa, and in return they said, can we have some more parishioners? And so 350 people went from Edessa out to India in the 320s AD. So there is this very, very strong link between Jesus, Edessa, Thomas, and this Edessan church in India. And of course, it was the ambassador of Alfred the Great who was sent to this place in India, to Malabar in India, to give them tribute in the 9th century. So with all of the troubles that Alfred the Great had fighting the Saxons and everything else, he took time to send money to India, to the Church of Edessa there. So people in that era did know that Edessa was something to do with this, something to do with the sort of gospel type story. And that is why the first crusade went to Edessa, because if you were going to find any secrets, you're not going to find them in Jerusalem so much, you're going to find them in Edessa. And immediately after the First Crusade, of course, we had the Knights Templar being set up as an organization to keep secrets. So what sort of secrets could they have found? Genealogies, artifacts maybe, holy grails perhaps, manuscripts, chronicles of the 1st century. What I think they might have found is something like my book, Jesus, King of Edessa, a secular chronicle of the 1st century that told this story. Yeah. Something like the History of the Kings of Judea by Justus of Tiberias. Now, we know all about this book because Josephus Flavius hates it.
Right.
And he says it's a tissue of lies. It lies, continuously. Well, what Josephus means is it's an alternative history to the one he gave, which is all pro-Roman, of course.
Yes.
And Justus of Tiberias would be writing from a Nazarene Jewish perspective, not a Roman perspective, and that would be possibly a very different history of the same events. That's why Josephus didn't like it. But of course, we don't have that history. It's gone. Josephus destroyed it. Yeah. So we don't have that alternative view of the 1st century.
It's that old saying. It's that old saying, isn't it? History is written by the victors again, isn't it?
Very much so. And Josephus was writing from a Roman perspective because his paymaster, his patron, was Emperor Vespasian. So everything had to agree with the Roman perspective. And what if they had found that book, perhaps, in Edessa, which gave the secular history of gospel events, rather like my Jesus King of Edessa book? Now, that would be supremely heretical.
It would, yeah.
You could not write that story in the 1st century, because it would say things like, Jesus was a king of Edessa, that he was alive in the AD 50s and 60s, that he was crucified in AD 70. I think we've talked about this already. And he was taken down from the cross by Josephus Flavius himself, because he says this. Josephus Flavius says this in his Vita, his autobiography, that he took the leaders of the Jewish revolt down from the cross. And 2 of them died, but 1 of them survived. Now, you could not write about that in the 1st century. So what are you going to do with that story? You can either lock it away somewhere, nice big castle somewhere with a big dungeon, and you lock it in some enormous great trunk somewhere, or you just print it. But you change the story slightly. So nobody quite knows what you're talking about. So you have to have a different name for the Jesus character. I mean, you could call him maybe Arthur, perhaps. And you can't have him in Judea, so perhaps you could say he was from Britain or Wales, because Jesus was a Galilean, he was a Gallis, and this is what the manuscripts say, that he was a Gallis, and that's been interpreted as being Wales, because Wales was called Gallis. But Gallis is also the Galileans.
Yeah.
So it's an easy confusion.
Well, yes.
Yes, and also sometimes I think with the early church fathers, they were deliberate confusions, weren't there?
Deliberate.
There were deliberate confusions left, right, and center. And here's a good one. This is why you can't just read things literally and expect them to be true, like many people have done, because it is not. So if I do a share screen again.
Okay. I've just noticed, by the way, Ralph, you've got the same shirt on as Gary tonight.
Oh, yes, we're
twins.
We've been to the same outfitter.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a giveaway. That's a giveaway, isn't it? Don't tell viewers; they'll start to talk.
Oh, Lord.
You've been swapping fashion tips, haven't you? I know.
We have
a conspiracy, Ralph. Oh, Lord.
So up on the screen now, we've that's high history. Nobody reads this book. It's very interesting because it's hugely heretical. It doesn't have any of the sort of history that Geoffrey of Monmouth has. It launches into a very different story. This is the best one, actually, because you can't read the Vulgate cycle. As I say, it's an enormous great book, 5,000 pages. But this one, Merlin and the Grail, by the same guy, this is Robert de Boron, and he had his hands in the Vulgate cycle. Anyway, Merlin and the Grail is only about, 180 pages. And it's like a brief summary of the Vulgate cycle. So this is well worth reading, and it gives some of the heresies that you will find in Arthurian legend. So that is Merlin and the Grail. Well worth getting. It's only a small book. This is the Vulgate cycle. So we've got 9 volumes, 10 volumes if you include the index. Utterly impenetrable and very expensive as well. If you buy the hardback, I think it's £2,000, I think, something of that nature. Oh my
goodness.
Oh, it's very expensive.
Wow.
But what I was going to say is not this. What I was going to say is what we expect sometimes of Arthurian legend is not what we actually get. So if we're looking at the father of King Arthur, he is, and everybody knows, I think he is, Uther Pendragon.
Mm-hmm.
Uther Pendragon, and Pendragon is a sort of Cornish, Celtic sort of name, Pendragon.
Head dragon.
The head of the dragon, Pendragon. But when you read the original manuscripts, it doesn't say Pendragon at all.
Oh.
So what it says, and here we've got an extract from one of the original manuscripts, and if you read along the top line here to the right-hand corner where I've got a circle around it, it says Uther Pendragon.
Pendragon.
Ben is son, isn't it?
Yes. If you understand that this was all written in Aramaic, not in Welsh.
Right.
Which, of course, Arthurian purists will jump up and down and foam at the mouth. You're not allowed to say such heresies.
Oh dear.
But, if we look at another one, here's another one. This one's written in Welsh. And what do we get? We get Uther Pendragon. And not as a surname, it's two separate words, Pendragon. And again, two separate words, Pendragon. Okay, now that's a bit of a problem, because we're talking Aramaic here and not Welsh. And as you say, Ben means son of. Dragon in Aramaic means fish. The dragons, the fish. So it means son of the fish.
Interesting.
Okay. The king, who was the Fisher King? Well, we have a line of Fisher Kings in Arthurian legend. So the father of King Arthur is the son of a fish. He's the first of the Fisher Kings. Now, who in the gospel story was the fisher of men?
Who indeed?
We get another connection with the Jesus character. And this is all because this was the age of Pisces. And do we have, yes, here we go. So the birth of King Arthur, it says, was foretold. There was a prophecy in the heavens above where a comet appeared, which had a comet in the shape of a fish that had two rays. So we've got a comet with two rays coming out. One signified Guinevere and the other signified King Arthur. So what was this comet? What was this portent in the skies above? I think it was this. So this is the zodiac of Dendera in Egypt. So the Dendera, it's a very famous one. It's Ptolemaic, actually, so it's probably about 2nd or 3rd century BC from a temple in Egypt. And it gives the standard zodiac as you would know it. But of course, Pisces on a standard zodiac is two rays ending in two fish. And you can see the rays here. So we've got a stick coming out to one fish here and a stick coming out to another fish here. This is the sign of Pisces. And it's two rays. But more than that, on this zodiac, these fish end up with circles around them. And the large one here is Isis. And the smaller one over here is Horus. Horus and Isis. So a lady and a man, a goddess and her son Horus. The moon and the sun. Well, in Arthurian legend, these two rays end up with Guinevere and Arthur. I think it's describing the Dendera zodiac.
Yeah.
So this is, the portent that foretold the coming of King Arthur. And it's exactly the same as this zodiac on Dendera. And of course, this is the first of the Fisher Kings. This is the first sign of the great month of Pisces.
Yes.
And
That's
that
a great
again
find, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it links us back.
Ralph.
Sorry, say again?
Sorry, that's a great find, Ralph, that is.
Yeah.
You can argue with that, really.
Well, this links us with the gospel events again, because Jesus was born as a lamb of God, but became a fisher of men. So he was born under the great month of Aries, but went into the great month of Pisces. He was the first of the Fisher Kings. And now we find that the father of King Arthur was called Ben Dragon, the son of the fish. He was a Fisher King.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's reminding me with because obviously the Jesus symbol is always very. Oh, you must have read my mind. I was just thinking of this.
More conspiracy theories.
It's obviously a sun symbol.
Oh Lord.
He's obviously a sun symbol, and of course here he's depicted as the sun with the signs of the zodiac. So going back to your earlier depiction of Arcturus on the mosaic that you showed us, where he's got a crown on and he's riding a goat. It looks to me like a goat. That's then very much reminding me of the zodiac, because the goat being Capricorn.
Capricorn.
Yes. Now, the imagery there is slightly wrong, of course, because Jesus was born between Aries and Pisces, which gives us a date of AD 10. And the zodiac we can see here, I've just switched onto this zodiac. This is the Hamat Tavera zodiac on the Sea of Galilee. And this zodiac was owned by Jesus, Jesus of Gamala. And it's a first century zodiac because the head of Helios is pointing at the join between Aries and Pisces. Note that Helios, as the sun god, is holding a sort of blue-green spherical earth in his gravitational grasp. So they knew the heliocentric model of the solar system. Now, this is on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. This is a Judaic zodiac, a Nazarene Jewish zodiac, owned by Jesus, Jesus of Gamala. And this is the level of knowledge they had, and this is the symbology that they had as well. And the symbology was of the zodiac. And so what looks like a zodiac?
Oh, the round table.
It's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is the Winchester round table. Now this is very old. This is for people who don't know it. This is down at Winchester. It was lucky to survive because it was the only part of the castle that survived. And this is a round table, an Arthurian round table from the 12th century. It was Edward I, wasn't it, made this table. So this table is like 900 years old or something, nearly. And the top character in this table is Henry VIII. But of course, this table shouldn't look like this. It should look like this. Oh, well, that's a bit close in, isn't it? But the sun character, the center, should be in the center of the zodiac.
Yes.
And so this round table is slightly wrong. The kingly sun character, or the Ursa Major character, should be sitting in the center of the zodiac, like in this one where we've got the sun in the center.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But if you look at zodiacs, you can either have the sun in the center or you can have Ursa Major, the northern constellations in the center. So you can either have the sun symbol, or you can have the Ursa Major, which is Arturus, the bear.
Yeah.
Now, the link here is that Arthurian legend says that there were 3 tables made.
Right.
The first table was the Last Supper table of Jesus. Jesus and his 12 disciples sitting around the table. The second table was the table of Joseph of Arimathea, him and his 12 disciples of his round table. So the Last Supper table was a round table. And the third table was the table of King Arthur and his 12 knights. So the disciples of Jesus and the knights of Arthur are the same symbolism, the same table. So the Arthurian round table is the Last Supper table. All of these tables were supposed to be based on the same design. And of course, what they're describing is the round table of King Arthur is a zodiac.
Yeah. Which is also very similar to a clock face, isn't it?
And a dartboard.
Of course. That's why we've got 12 hours to the clock. It's the same symbolism.
And of course,
so the Last Supper.
Sorry, I was just going to also say, add into that also the 12 star gods of Horus in the Amduat as well.
Yep, and the 12 stars that surrounded the head of Mary. When it describes Mary as standing on the moon with 12 golden stars round her head. It's 12 because there were 12 tribes, there were 12 disciples, there are 12 constellations in the zodiac. It's
and the 12 labors of Hercules.
Yeah, and as you said, Horus is an anagram of hours, isn't it?
Horus is an anagram of hours, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a connection there, but yes, it's certainly very similar. So the Arthurian table should look like this one. So this is a round table from a Hollywood film, and they've got a hole in the center of the table.
It's like a donut.
So this, yes, it's a donut-shaped table, and this is what the Arthurian table should look like, because the king should sit in the center of the table, because he is the sun in the center of the zodiac, or he is the Arthur, the Ursa Major, in the middle of the zodiac. It should look like this one. Now, this one is again on the Sea of Galilee. This is the Bet Shean zodiac, which is in a Christian monastery, just south of the Sea of Galilee. And this is a Christian one, so they've had to Christianize it a little bit, but it's obviously still a zodiac, but you've just got months of the year, instead of having constellations of the zodiac.
And what looks
but in
to
the
be
center,
the sun and the moon.
Yeah, in the center you have the sun and the moon, as a man and a woman in the center, because that's what you would get in the center of the zodiac. Now, who was the man and the woman surrounded by 12 disciples?
Jesus and Mary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
I mean, it's a shame that the listeners can't. Sorry, Ralph. It's a shame that the listeners can't see the pictures, because really it gives you some clues, doesn't it?
Yeah, later on they'll have to have a quick look on YouTube and see the video. You can pick out pictures then. But okay, so this is the Jesus and Mary character. But if we're talking about Arthurian legend, we're talking about the Arthur and Guinevere characters, and they were supposed to be brother and sister, of course. Just as I've said that Jesus and Mary were probably brother and sister as well. It's the same story. And that's interesting, because we now have, I'll just do a stop share there. We now have a very different view of what Arthurian legend is all about. If this is a story that's come back from the Near East with the Knights Templar, and it's a story that they couldn't tell openly, so they had to change the characters slightly so you wouldn't know what they were talking about. Arthurian legend is the gospel story. King Arthur is King Jesus. Guinevere is Mary Magdalene. But they couldn't tell that story openly, so they've changed their names, they've changed the dates a little bit, and they've changed the location, but not really. It's still called Galles. So that they could tell this story without being burnt at the stake. So you can tell this story in plain sight. It's a secret that is held in plain sight, because no one would guess that this story is about the New Testament, and you could not be burnt at the stake for telling this story, because you're just telling a story about some lost king of Britain. Who cares about a lost king of Britain? But to those people who were in the know, you could whisper in their ear and just say, Arthur is Jesus.
I mean, all the depictions
is that what it's about?
Sorry, Ralph. All the depictions of Jesus have got the flame round it, or the sun round it, haven't they? So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah,
I mean, you can't argue with what you're saying, can you?
Well, and also we have this oddity where things like high history and history of the Holy Grail say that the author of Arthurian legend was Josephus Flavius. That's a real problem for Arthurian purists. How on earth can we have a first century Judaic historian who is writing the early elements of Arthurian legend? It's just impossible. And it's also illogical. Why would anyone make up this story to say that the author was Josephus Flavius? It makes no sense.
No.
Unless you know what this story was talking about. I mean, even when we come on to things like Wolfram von Eschenbach with his Parsifal. So this is the German version, which is very readable, actually. That's a very good version of Arthurian legend. And so, and Wolfram, we think, was a Knights Templar. He was a knight at the very least. And we think he was a Knights Templar. He keeps talking about the Knights Templar. And he gives us lots of insights into the knightly tradition. Like he says, knights are not in shining armor. They're all red with rust because it rusts so quickly. And so they're not in shining armor at all. They're all red. And he says that knights carry... So you have a whole retinue. You don't have a knight, because a knight is like a tank in modern warfare, and it needs all of this equipment to maintain this tank. Well, your knight in shining armor needs a couple of wagons and 12 people to look after this knight in shining armor. And they carry bundles of spears in packs of 6 because they break them so often. So yeah, lots of very interesting bits about medieval sort of knights from Wolfram von Eschenbach. But anyway, he tells this story of King Arthur, and he starts the story exactly where you would expect it, in Mesopotamia. So the story starts in Mesopotamia with fire fits, with Gamuret, who's the father of Percival, who's working for a king in Mesopotamia. Again, we're talking about the Near East here. We're not talking about Wales. And the story doesn't get to Wales until we have 2 knights. We have Firefitz, who is the knight who was born in Mesopotamia, and then Percival, who was the knight who was born in Galles. But of course, Galles can mean Galilee as easily as it can Wales. So you get all of these confusions. And I suppose we could talk about the galleys, couldn't we?
Absolutely.
I'm not sure if we talked about. Yeah. This is the eunuch priests of Kibel, because the main characters in Arthurian legend are not King Arthur. King Arthur doesn't get very much of a mention in this. The main characters are the wounded king and the fisher king, because we have this line of fisher kings. And of course, we know that Jesus was a fisher of men, of course. But we have this wounded king who was wounded between the thighs. So we're probably talking about castration here.
Mm-hmm.
And because the king was wounded, the land becomes a wasteland. And we get a direct connection there with the Edessan monarchy, because when they converted to Judaism, and okay, they were talking about circumcision rather than castration, they were afraid that their lands would become a wasteland because they were not sure if the people would accept their kings being Jewish, converting to Nazarene Judaism and getting circumcised or castrated. And so we get a direct link there between the history of the first century and Arthurian legend, which says exactly the same thing. And so we have this cult of the castrated king in Arthurian legend, which is exactly what Jesus says. So people don't seem to know this, but Jesus asked for his disciples to castrate themselves.
Goodness me.
So,
ouch.
Yeah. It's not preached quite often from the pulpit, but this
Not
comes from the
recommended.
Gospel of Matthew.
No. I don't think there'd be that many followers.
Christianity go bank back, wouldn't it? Cast.
Yes. Your lesson today is how to castrate. No. This comes from the Gospel of Matthew, 19:11.
Oh,
and Jesus says to his disciples, he says, all men cannot receive this saying except to those to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs which were born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs by men. But there are some eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. He is asking his disciples to castrate themselves. Why? Because the galley priests of the sacred stone were eunuchs. Traditionally, they were always eunuchs. And the sacred stone we have from Wolfram von Eschenbach is known as the Holy Grail. So the Grail itself has several facets to it. And if you only know the first facet, you'll never understand what the Grail is. So on the initial level, it is the Sangreal. It is the Holy Cup. Yeah. But it can be the Sangreal, as you say. It can be the Blood Royal as well, if you pronounce it slightly differently. So that's supposed to be the cup that Jesus used. Again, we're going back to first century Judea again. The cup that took the drops of blood from Jesus when he was stabbed. So that's the first level. But on the second level, we're talking about blood. We're talking about bloodlines. And we get this inference from Arthurian legend. This is in Parsifal. And so we have the Knights of the Round Table who are initiating a new knight. This is Firefitz, the knight who came from Mesopotamia. And he's being initiated, and they are going to show him the Grail. And the princess comes out before him to show him the Grail. And the knights say to him, "Can you see the Grail?" And he says, no. He's looking left and he's looking right. He says, no, I can't see. anything except for this princess holding a green cloth. And of course, all of the other knights fall about laughing. Because she is the Grail. She is the bloodline. She is the royal bloodline, and the Grail is her womb. It's shaped like a Grail. So that's the sort of second aspect of the Holy Grail. But the third aspect of the Holy Grail, again from Parsifal, is that it was a sacred stone. So, yeah, we could go on to the sacred stone. Just before we go on to the sacred stone, because we've not talked about the sacred stones, have we, before?
No.
No.
I don't think so. So before we get there, let's have a look at these eunuchs, because they are closely connected with the gospel story again. These eunuchs were the galley priests who held the sacred stone, which we're going to talk about. And this was a big thing in the first century. And Lucian says of these galley, he says, on these days, men become galley priests. For while the rest are playing flutes and performing rites, a frenzy comes upon many, and he throws off his clothes and rushes to the center with a great shout, and takes a sword, and immediately castrates himself.
Ow.
And then he rushes through the city, holding his testicles in his hands. And he takes female clothing, as you do, yeah. And he takes female clothing and women's adornments from whichever house he throws the testicles into. So if a pair of testicles come whizzing through your window, you have to give the guy a dress.
Okay.
What a load of bleep. Oh, Lord.
Yeah.
Oh, God. My eyes are watering, Ralph, I've got to be honest.
I think a dressing and some bandage, I think, as well.
He's just crossed his legs, look.
Oh, Lord. Oh, the pain.
I bet that made your eyes water, didn't it?
Certainly did.
But Josephus Flavius tells the same sort of thing. So he gives a story about the Jewish revolt and the people who were the fighters who were working in the Jewish revolt. And he calls them Galileans. Mm-hmm. But of course, remember, Jesus and Saul were both Galileans. So it doesn't necessarily mean you came from Galilee. This is the Galley priests were known as Galileans. And he says the Galileans indulged themselves in feminine wantonness, and they decked their hair and put on women's garments, and were smeared with ointments that they may appear very comely. But while their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with their right hands, and while their gait was effeminate, they attacked men and became warriors, and drew their swords from under their finely decked cloaks, and ran everybody through that they came upon. So these were knights dressed as women, who were operating during the Jewish revolt. And we have some imagery, I think, of these. Let me see. That's all sacred stones. Let me have a look at another one.
It's quite interesting because it's reminding me as well that in India there is actually a sect of people actually that do dress as women, and they go around sort of singing and fortune telling, I think, and all sorts of different things. So I'm wondering if there's some kind of connection to that.
Very much so. They are the Hijra. And I have a picture somewhere, if I can just find it, of the Hijra. And yes, since this church got to India, of course, the Church of Malabar, it may well be that there is a connection here somewhere. Because I'm still looking. Here. Yes, I was looking in the wrong place. Okay, if I do a quick screen share.
Okay.
And show a window and show this one and share that.
Here we go.
There you go. That should come up.
Yeah.
And that is the Hijra.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
These are the transvestites of India. Well, they're not just transvestites. They are castrated. And some of them also have a penectomy.
Oh, okay.
They go the whole hog,
Right.
which is pretty much the same as Saul said. You know, Saul in the epistles says, you know, if the Jews like if what did he say? If they like circumcision so much, why don't they just cut off the whole penis and have done with it?
Oh.
That again is from the epistles from the New Testament. So it's quite a racy book in places.
It is indeed, yeah.
I don't ever remember this at Sunday school, Ralph.
No, they don't teach that one in Sunday school. No.
You're a very naughty boy, Ralph.
That's in Corinthians, I think, that one, so you can look it up. So what we have this image, which people might think is unbelievable, of these galley priests, something to do with the Church of Jesus and James, the Nazarene, and some of their priests castrated themselves and wore women's dresses, more specifically red dresses. And you think, well, that's all a bit strange, you know, that's from a different era, a different location. It's got nothing to do with Christianity. It's got absolutely, oh, wait a minute.
Holy Father.
Holy Father. Of course, they do exactly the same today. Nothing has changed.
No.
Yeah.
This is so we're looking at a picture of a bishop. Is he a bishop? No, I think he's a cardinal, this guy.
Mm-hmm.
So this is in Rome. This is a cardinal going into St. Peter's, and he's wearing a red dress.
Yeah.
Now, the only thing we don't know is whether he's got a sword hidden underneath his dress, like Josephus says, or whether he's still got his tackle or not. But they still dress up in women's dresses in exactly the same fashion, complete with a nice frilly petticoat as well.
It is nice.
I was going to remark upon the lovely lace work going on there.
Yes. I mean, this is not just a cloak, is it? This is definitely sort of women's attire, I would say.
Very nice.
They still do exactly the same today.
Mm.
So, yes, we do have this conundrum that this was all descended from.
It's also interesting, Ralph. They've got some sort of skull cap on, haven't they, as well?
Yeah, he's wearing a skull cap, yeah, so in the Jewish tradition. Which, of course, most Christian priests don't. But, you know, the Pope does. If you ever see the Pope, he's always got a skull cap just the same. So there are many similarities here with what we find from, I'll just stop that screen, from this ancient history.
Amazing.
Which sort of puts us into a discussion about the Holy Grail, doesn't it?
Yes.
So the Holy Grail stone. So we have this sacred stone that has gone through history, and it's something to do with the gospel story and something to do with ancient history. So here is this sacred stone. So that should come up in a minute. There we go.
There we are. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the Benben stone. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Egyptian history, but the Benben was the sacred stone of Egypt.
Yeah.
And it was the primeval mound upon which, you know, the world was founded. Yeah. And it sounds very similar to the Ark story, the Ark of Noah, with a bird going out and finding this land in the middle of the sea. Well, that's exactly what they say in Egyptian creation myth. And the sea in Egyptian history was actually the cosmos more than the earth. So the heavens above were a sacred sea, as it were, a cosmic sea. And that sea was known as the the Sea of Nu, from which we get Noah or Noah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the image we've got here is of a sort of rocky mound with a bird sitting on it, who's a sunbird. So we know this is the phoenix sitting on this mound, this sacred
just
stone.
read my mind again there, Ralph.
So this stone was taken to Greece, I think with Alexander the Great probably. And here it is in Delphi.
Oh, is that the Omphalos stone?
That is the Omphalos, yep, it is indeed. So that's the Omphalos stone. Now, sometimes it had netting on it. So you can see it's not actually very big. It's only about 2 foot high at most. Conical sort of stone. It was supposed to be a meteorite. This one isn't. It's a copy, of course. This is only a rough piece of limestone. But this is at Delphi. This picture is at Delphi when I went to Delphi. And the stone ended up in Delphi for a while. And then it went to, it went over to Parthia. So this is the stone in Parthia, or Persia, as it were. And what we can see here is Apollo. So this is a coin. It's a Parthian coin with Apollo sitting on the Omphalos stone. And you can see it's got netting on it again. We're not quite sure what this netting means. But it's an important stone because we've got God is sitting on it. So this is a throne of the gods. And then, oh, it does come up good. I thought that was not going to be there. Then this stone went to Edessa. So here's a picture of Edessa. So here's just a map of the region. Mediterranean Sea is on the bottom left. And if we go from the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea and head eastwards across the Euphrates, we come to Edessa. You can see Edessa there with a purple arrow pointing at it. In the green section of the Osrone, they call it.
Yeah.
So it's, in modern terms, it's north of Aleppo in Syria, and you get to Turkey. They call it Sanliurfa now. It's in modern Turkey, but it used to be in Syria. And that's the city of Edessa. That's where the First Crusade went to. You can see how far from the Mediterranean they went to get to Edessa. It's a long way east of the Mediterranean. And this is modern Edessa when I went there last time. This is just a look at the citadel on the top of the hill. You can see a castle up there. So we know Edessa existed. We have a lot of archaeology from that region. We have the palace of the 2nd century kings of Edessa and so on is still there, or at least the mosaics are. Anyway, the reason for mentioning Edessa about this stone is the stone ended up in Edessa. And here we see the stone when it came to Edessa. So we're looking at a coin here, and on the right-hand image we have a temple, and inside the temple there is a stone, there is a box, a square thing, and you will see some people say that this is a cubic Bethel, which means a cubic Omphalos stone. I don't think they're right. I think this is one of these, the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
So it's not a stone, it's a box. And a box, the Ark of the Covenant is a Bethel. A Bethel means a house of God, because they used to put the gods inside these boxes. So what we're looking at here is the Ark of Tutankhamun in the Cairo Museum. And it's identical to the description of the Ark of the Covenant. It's the same ratio of sides. It's got the same sort of sloping top on it, roof on it, and it has the same bronze rings underneath it to hold the two handles. You can see the handles poking out the front there. So it's exactly the same as described in the Old Testament for the Ark of the Covenant. So these arks were quite common. All of the pharaohs had arks like this, and they either held documents, treasures or the images of the gods. They used to put images of the gods inside these things. And of course, if you remember back from the Old Testament, what was put in the Ark of the Covenant was the 2 sacred stones of God, upon which the 10 Commandments was inscribed by God.
Yeah.
So it had sacred stones inside this box. And so when this box was in Edessa, here's another coin. We see another temple here with a square box inside it. You can see little feet on the bottom of the box. This is the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why Edessa was so important, because they owned the Ark of the Covenant in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And inside that box would be this sacred omphalos stone. But then it was taken by the Emessans. So just below Edessa, there was another city-state called Emesa, who were very similar. And I still have to do some research into this kingdom because it has so many similarities with the Edessan kingdom.
Right.
So this is based just south of Damascus. So this is Homs and Hama, where the Syrian revolt started, 10 years ago. And again, this is a coin, and again we can see a temple, and inside the temple is the sacred stone. And now we can see the stone, so it's not in a box.
Yeah.
And again, it's just like it was at Delphi. It's a conical stone, and it's embossed with the phoenix again. You can see the phoenix on it. The body is in the center, 2 wings to the left and right. And now it's called the Elagabal. So it's no longer called the Omphalos. It now has a new name. It's the Elagabal, or the Heliogabal in the Greek, which means the mountain of God. So it's only a small mountain, of course, but it's a small mountain of the gods. It's a sacred stone.
Something I'm just to interject, maybe something and nothing, but it's very interesting that Monty Python, who most people know and love with their comedies, they did the Holy Grail, didn't they? Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Well, in it, King Arthur, Richard Graham Chapman, has the sun on his tabard, so he's giving you a clue there. But what's interesting, actually, is the name Monty Python. Now, they give some flippant excuse about where the name came from, because he said, it sounds like some slimy creature of an agent. However, Monty, actually, the name originates in the name mountain, and Python obviously comes from Pythia. So that's quite interesting.
Yes, it does.
Delphi.
Yeah, I didn't make that connection, but yes, there is a connection to be made there. Yes. I wonder if they were making an oblique reference to this.
Maybe.
I don't know, actually. That's worth having a look into. It's amazing how many people have sort of understood little parts of this story, but maybe not understood the whole story itself.
I think that's what you do, Ralph, is you're bringing a lot of stuff into to people's consciousness, Well,
we'll see that. We'll see that some people do know about this, because we have some evidence. We'll look at that in a minute.
Okay.
So this stone was in Syria, in Emesa, as I say, near Damascus. Well, one of their kings of this region in 220 AD became emperor of Rome. He was a Syrian emperor, and his name was Emperor Elagabalus, because he was a priest of the Elagabal stone. His actual name was Antonius, I think. But anyway, everyone calls him Elagabalus.
Or Tony.
So this is a Rome. Say again?
Tony to his friends.
Tony to his friends, yes, he probably was, yeah. Well, yes, especially this guy, because this guy was a galley priest. The same as we were talking about Jesus having his galley priests, and therefore he asked his disciples to castrate themselves. Well, this guy castrated himself.
Oh, dear.
Which wasn't actually allowed in Rome. So now they have a Roman emperor who's actually illegally castrated himself, because And he was quite infamous for this. He was much hated in Rome because of this. And then he deflowered the Vestal Virgins as well.
Got no soul to work with, what? Oh Lord!
They didn't like him for the start because of his Eastern ways and his Eastern dress, and then he was castrated and all the rest of it. And he brought his Eastern religion with him, and of course, what he brought was the Elagabal stone. And here we can see it on the right-hand side, sitting in a chariot, a quadriga chariot, no less, with 4 horses. Let's zoom in and have a look at that a little bit. There we go. That's better. And you can see the Elagabal stone is sitting in the chariot. And again, it's a conical stone. Actually, it's egg-shaped, but you can't see the bottom of it. Sitting in the chariot, and again, you can see it's got the phoenix inscribed on it. 2 wings and a body, and a star to the left, which is probably the star of Venus. So we get the male and the female. Obviously, Venus is female. And this stone was taken to Rome, and it had a temple built for it, and it became the cult image of Rome, although it wasn't greatly liked over in Rome. And later on, because they got rid of it, Elagabalus only lasted about 5 years before he was murdered, and the stone went missing from Rome. But its heritage stayed on, and it became Sol Invictus, the famous invincible sun. Was an offshoot of this religion in this stone. But this stone went missing. So we're talking here about 220 AD, and it goes missing from Rome. I have a theory, and it's not based on too much evidence, that it went to Chester in Britain.
I think I know where you're going with this story. I think.
Yeah. Did we talk about the Fortress Diwa in Chester?
No.
Okay, that's another thing we must talk about.
Okay.
Because I think it ended up there. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But since we're on this sacred stone, have a look at the stone, see what it looks like. This is supposed to be a meteorite. It's supposed to be conical shaped like this, maybe even slightly egg shaped, because you can never see the base of it. So it would be blackened. It was said to be black. It was the black stone. Pockmarked, because it's a meteorite that's come in as the fiery phoenix, because remember, the fiery phoenix is a bird that is a piece of the sun that's broken off from the sun and come to earth in a great fiery ball and ended up on the ground somewhere. So you know what it's going to look like. So there's me sitting in a cinema watching a James Bond film. I think it was called Skyfall, which is an apt name, isn't it? Skyfall.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I was sitting there watching this Bond film, and then I fell off my chair because they had the Elagabal in a Bond film.
Okay.
And what on earth is it doing there? Now, it didn't seem to have much connection with the rest of the film. So Bond was being chased by the baddie, and he was captured by the baddie in North Africa, who had his lair of this baddie was in a meteor crater. And so Bond is taken into this complex, and in the middle of this complex, he has a planetarium, and they walk into the planetarium, and what is there but the Elagabal stone? And here it is sitting on 3 legs, this big meteorite, and it's quite, well, they say it's a meteorite, but it looks exactly the same as the Elagabal. And then the baddie makes this speech about this being the oldest stone in the entire universe and how lonely this stone is. And it had nothing to do with the rest of the Bond film whatsoever. So I'm left wondering why on earth it is there. You know, are they fans of my books or something?
Maybe. Or maybe they're know some knowledge that other people don't, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Ralph,
do they know something about the Elagabal? Because not many people do know about the Elagabal.
No, they don't. Ralph, I've just been told that we've only got about 5 minutes left, unfortunately, and which is
okay.
So I'm really sorry about that.
Give us your best shot, Ralph, in these 5 minutes.
Okay, well, as the final bit, then we'll stop sharing here and let's go to an image of this stone in Scotland, because it was supposed to be taken to Scotland, and they know it as the Stone of Scone over there.
The Stone of Destiny.
And it's the Stone of Destiny. You know all about it, yeah. And so let's see if I can do a share for this one. So while I was there, because I'm a Knights Templar, I'm a Mason, I went to the Knights Templar meeting. There we go. So now you've got an image of a cross, yes? I went to a Templar meeting in Scotland, and they say that they have this stone in Scotland.
Right.
Now, I've never seen it. I have no evidence that it is actually there, but they maintain that they still have this stone in Scotland, and it has the power of levitation. And they've kept it for the last 1,000-1,500 years up in Scotland. This is the stone that King Charles was supposed to be coronated on, but but they've got a rough piece of sandstone, not the real stone. The real stone is kept near Roslin. And anyway, so they produced this video. So this is actually a little video, and I'll have to forgive the quality here. This was produced 15 years ago, so it's not very good quality. But anyway, this is what they say the stone looks like. So I'll just play it, and you'll see it's hidden in this hole under the cross. And they go down. This is the stone, and it levitates itself up out of the hole and off through the church.
Wow.
And that is what they say. Just play that again. That is what they say the Elagabal stone is, and they say it is in Scotland. And it has the power of levitation. And off it goes. Marvelous. So yeah, that is the Elagabal stone and the history of the Elagabal. It's a long story that we could go on and talk about how it got to Britain in the
well, maybe we should do a part 2.
Early third century.
Maybe we should do a part 2.
Yeah, I think we could, because that follows on from the story of. Yes, I think we should. It follows on from the story of Jesus as well.
Well, you're such an interesting man, Ralph, that I think people deserve to hear some more.
Sorry, I missed that last bit because Gary was talking.
Yes. Well, we could have another go. I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about.
I think there's so much more to talk about. I mean, we haven't even touched upon I mean, I know maybe it's not quite your field in that, but also the spiritual aspects of the Grail story and the Arthurian story as well, because there's quite a lot behind that. It's a spiritual story of the soul, shall we say, isn't it?
Yeah, I try not to get involved too much in that, because that can be a contentious issue. So I just do the history rather than anything else. But you can still add on any spirituality you like to this story. All I'm doing is saying that this is the history upon which the Gospels were written.
Yeah.
And then if you want to believe that Jesus is the Son of God on top of that, well, that's fine. That's up to you. But I'm just saying who these people were in the historical record.
Which is fantastic. And it basically
interestingly enough, the secular story.
Sorry, I was just going to say it leaves it now.
I was just going to say the secular story concurs very, very closely.
Yes, Indeed. Ralph, it's always a pleasure talking to you because you're so fascinating, and I'm so sorry that we have to leave it there, but thank you again. Thank you, listeners, as well, and thank you for joining us on the Allens Investigate this evening. You can check us out at www.theallensinvestigate.com, and on Facebook and Instagram. We're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 and 107.7 FM from the beautiful city of New Orleans, and on Roku TV. So amazing stuff as always from Ralph, and thank you so much for listening.
Ralph.
And thank you, Ralph.
Great stuff.